Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Russ. Great songs. We are a church that is here to help people find and follow Jesus. If you are a guest with us this morning, we want to just extend a warm welcome to you. And if you're joining us online, we are grateful that you're with us. One of the ways that we love to just be the hands and feet of Jesus is we just love to serve our community. And so last night, because of all your help, your generosity, we got together and went for a walk last night. We had a great time. Thank you for everyone that participated, everyone that gave and your generous donations. I do need to say this, that we exceeded our goal. We had a goal of $2,500, and we went to $3,815. So you got to give yourselves a hand. It's grateful for you. Not only did we get to 153% of our goal, the mustard seed got to over 133% of their goal as well. So we just been able to work together, and it was great to be able to walk with others last night and celebrate just our community. And we just, again, so grateful for your generosity, and it was a great time. We are going to continue in our series. It was funny, we started the song Walking in Sunlight, and I thought, thank God last night we walked in sunlight, and it was a great night to walk. It was definitely not the coldest night of the year, and we are grateful for that, because last week it would have been a much different story. So we are in the middle of a series called All in the Family, and I just want to welcome those who might be new for the first time just hearing this message. We've done about 3 lessons now in this series, but the whole idea is to go back through some of the families in the Bible and just see how messy they are. I think sometimes we have this thought that people that are written about in the Bible were perfect, and you know what? We're discovering that they're far from perfect. And I just want for these stories to challenge us, these accounts in the Bible to encourage us and to remind us of this one powerful truth. And this is the powerful truth I want us to get, is that God doesn't wait for perfect people. He works with broken people to bring about his perfect plan. So now that puts us all on an equal level playing field, so we can all rest assured that God is perfect. We are not, but he's continually redeeming us. Thank you, Phil, for your prayer and just reminding us of that. And that word adoption, being adopted into a family, really is something special that we share because of we're being part of God's family. Now, whether you're thriving as a family, whether you're struggling, or whether you're just barely hanging on as a family, I want you to understand something, that every family is a platform to demonstrate God's story of redemption and restoration. And this is really important for us as we come here, because there is a lot that we are dealing with in our lives. And a lot of us tried to hide. When we get here, we want to just pretend that everything's going okay, but it's okay to realize that sometimes that's not always the case. And we want to be a safe place and a safe group of people where we can come together and share where we're really wrestling. And one of the things that is really important, we sang a song to wait on the Lord, is while we wait, God is working, and we need to trust his timing, not your timeline. And that's what this whole message is about today. And so I'm hoping that if you don't remember anything else about this message, that you will remember that while we wait, God is working. And so we can trust in his timing and not our timeline. A number of years ago, Marnie and I, when we were earlier on in our marriage, our kids were young, but we found ourselves in a financial situation where things were tough. And maybe many of you are in that situation. For a lot of young families, that just seems to be the way it is. Things are tough financially when you get started. And we had the perfect idea pitched to us. It was an idea where you could, if you just put in a little bit of an investment, you were going to be able to reap the benefits of much money coming in. And we'd be well on our way to making back the initial investment and to become a little more financially secure. Anybody had one of those offers to you? At the time, again, we were wrestling financially, and we'd been praying for God to come through. because we were just wondering how we were going to pay rent and how we were going to buy groceries. And so we thought, you know what? Somehow this just looks like maybe it's our answer. And so we rushed in head first. We paid the initial investment. And do you know that that initial investment turned into more debt for us? We tried phone call after phone call trying to get other people to come into this idea, and it never worked. But the person that invited me in, they were making money hand over fist, and it was so frustrating. But I realized something. I realized that I stepped ahead of God, and I didn't trust in His timing. See, the returns never came. And almost every meeting and phone call ended in more frustration and discouragement. And so no matter how hard we worked, we couldn't get ahead. And so we struggled. And when the realization finally hit us that maybe we stepped ahead of God, not just because of the debt we were feeling, but because we leaned on our own understanding rather than the wisdom of God. And we learned an important word back then. It was called surrender. Sometimes we just need to learn to surrender, because when we try to force God and try to speed up God and try to help God, we only end up in more frustration, heartache, and regret. And I'm sure someone here can relate to a story like that in your life. The season was painful, but it was actually a season where we had a lot of growth in our idea and our view of who this God is. It produced a different type of relationship with this God that we had to come to realize. And so many of us can relate to this. Maybe you're struggling through a financial situation in your life right now. You're making financial decisions to kind of help God along, and you've maxed out your credit card, and maybe you're starting on your second credit card. And with this thought that I'm going to make it back later, so if I just invest now, and I just think sometimes we do that, don't we? And this financial peace that we're looking for just gets further and further away. Maybe for some of us, it's relationships. And I know for a lot of us, we've wrestled with this over the years, and maybe you're in one right now, where you've prayed for the right partner, and you're asking God for the right person in your life, and you've waited and waited, and then the first person comes along and you jump in head first and you realize, I just don't want to be lonely. So this must be as good as it gets. And you convince yourself that this is God's will, but deep down inside, you know that this isn't God's best. And parents, we often do this with our kids. We try to steer our kids, and we try to coerce our kids into certain areas of life, like school sports or different types of education or different groups. And we move our kids trying to ensure their success, but we do it in a way that just pushes them further and further from a relationship with us, because it's out of fear and it's out of anxiety. And sometimes we do that with our careers. We jump into a career path, first one that comes along. You're longing for that job or that promotion, and you don't sit back to realize some of the consequences of this decision, and you jump in because it's more money. And then all of a sudden you realize a few months later that you're just frustrated. See, in all these situations, I think the heart behind it and the heart behind our actions, it's all the same. It all narrows down and boils down to the same. It feels like God is taking too long. He's taking too long. And so God needs some help. And so I'm going to help him. And it only moves us towards more stress, to more regret and confusion. Now, our impatience often leads to poor decisions that hurt others and damage others in our relationships. It's not just us that it hurts others as well. Impatience in relationships often grows to tension and resentment and regret. Now, I want to transition here. See, For those of us here that are familiar with this family that I'm going to talk about, maybe you learned about them in Sunday school. Maybe you learned about them through reading of the Old Testament as you're going through. But I want to share a verse with you, and I want you to look at it closely. And this is from Hebrews. So this is taking a really short snapshot of this family as this Hebrew writer, the writer of Hebrews, is telling us. And I want to see if maybe we get the wrong picture from this verse. And this is what it says in Hebrews chapter 6, 13 through 15. When God made his promise to Abraham, now you know who we're talking about, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself. I just wanted to add that first part. I just think this is so awesome about God. That God couldn't swear to anything greater than himself. I think this is so cool. So he makes a promise after swearing to himself. He says, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so, after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. Now, if that is all you know about Abraham, you're probably thinking, oh, great. Here's another minister talking about this family in the Old Testament who had it all together, and I'm going to learn a lesson about patience. I think we're missing the point. We have to dig a little bit further into this, because I think that a lot of us have more in common with Abe than we think. And so I want to just share that with you this morning. I want to begin by asking this question. Did Abraham really wait patiently? This is the challenge we're up against. You may think so if this is the only verse you read about Abraham, but I would like to discover a little bit more as we dig into his life. See, Abraham, you may have a lot more in common with Abraham than you think. So I'm going to zoom in here for a minute. This is one of those accounts in the Bibles where we see a family trying to go ahead of God's timing. This is someone who actually didn't wait for God to come through very often, although the Hebrew writer says. But we'll get back to that and why he's saying that in a moment. But Abram, okay, I'm going to confuse the two as I'm going through this message, so I want to just get this out first. Abram was his name before he became Abraham. God changed his name later, and we'll get to that point. But right now he's Abram. So if I say Abraham before we get there, please forgive me. Abram was 75 years old when God makes this promise. 75. That he would be the father of many nations. So let's just go back to Genesis and just have a look at what the promise actually was. It's in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 4. It says, Then the Lord had said to Abram, Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went. He went. Wow. Talk about faith. Leaving your family, everything you're comfortable with, your country, moving to a country. And guess what? He doesn't even ask God where he's going. That is huge. There's a man that can be recognized for his faith. But there's a big problem with the promise is that Abram is 75, his wife is 65, well past childbearing years. So we're going to fast forward the story just a little bit. Along their journey to where they were going, where they hadn't asked God where they're going, they're allowing God to lead them. They come into a situation where they're running out of food in their land. And so they have to make a detour. And they make this detour to Egypt because there's food there. But there's a problem. You see, Sarai, Abram's wife, is gorgeous. I mean, she's beautiful. And so Abram has this thought that, what's going to happen? And this is, if you want to know what anxiety is, this is what anxiety is. Watch this. Now there was a famine, this is in 12:10 through 13. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. That's something, husbands, that's a good thing to say to your wife. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Do you see where the anxiety is? Anxiety has to be one of the things that we do so often is we make up stories of what's going to happen before they even happen. And where's the trust in God in this? So he's going to lie. Well, Pharaoh does end up taking Sarai into his household once he gets there, but God steps in. He intervenes and he strikes Pharaoh's house with disease, and then Pharaoh rebukes Abram and says, get out of here, and he sent them away. Decades pass. Decades pass since God gave the promise that he was going to become the father of many children and many nations, but there's no sign of a child. And you can only imagine how the tension grew within this family and how the tension would have been in their home. Day after day, Sarai wondering, is God really going to come through here? Because it doesn't feel like it. Month after month, no sign of a child, no pregnancy. Year after year, the silence from heaven must have been deafening. And you know what? We all can relate. Because there's always situations where we are waiting for God to come through, and we decide something in that waiting period is, does God need some help? Have you ever waited patiently for something that you believed God promised only to feel like nothing was happening? So eventually Sarai takes matters into her own hands and wants to control the situation. And so this is what happens in Genesis 16, 1 through 2. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave, and perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. Now, I just find this fascinating. If we can just go back 3 lessons to Adam and Eve when they're in the garden. The snake is tempting Eve with this fruit that she is not supposed to eat from. And so the snake deceives her by saying, you could be like God. And she takes matters into her own hands, and she takes from the fruit, but then she gives some to Adam, who was right there with her. Right there with her. Is this not the same thing? If Abram believed in the promise that God was going to come through, he could have stopped everything right there. But he didn't. He agreed to it. And I don't know, guys, sometimes when it's about sex, it's like, there's a weakness for a lot of us with that. And he goes ahead and sleeps with Hagar. Well, for a moment, they thought, see? It all worked out. Problem solved. God, we helped. But things didn't stay that way for long. Before jealousy, resentment, bitterness soon took over the entire family. Sarai grew angry with Hagar. Hagar became defiant. Abram was caught in the middle, and the whole household became a mess full of tension and dysfunction. Now, there's something amazing about God. God doesn't give up on his promise, and even Hagar and Ishmael, her son, born to them, he took care of. But it wasn't part of God's plan. But he still works through our helping him along. He can still bring about his promises, and that's really important for us to remember. God doesn't abandon them. He doesn't throw up his hands and say, well, you ruined it. I'm done. God remained faithful to his original promise. Now I want to fast forward even more. We're going from the time, the original promise, we're going 24 years ahead. God's going to reconfirm his promise, even after all the mistakes that they made along the journey. Now, this is where Abram's name gets changed to Abraham, which means father of many. Again, he still doesn't have a child yet from the promise. And God also changes Sarai's name, which means to Sarah, which means laughter. Because this is really funny, actually. Because God's plans are usually funny because they don't work out the way we think they should work out. And God's going to reconfirm his promise that he made 24 years ago. But listen to how Abraham responds when God reaffirms his promise. Abraham fell face down, he laughed. And he said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And so God answers. And he says this. Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and I will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And this is where we just need to stop for a minute, because at reading that at just, from this distance and just trying to absorb it, this is a promise for something that we are actually all here today celebrating. And when we don't see this, we're going to have a time where we're going to remember Jesus together in just a little bit. This is all part of the plan. Because when he's talking about descendants, this is the lineage that Jesus is going to come through, because God has a plan to redeem his people and bring us back into the family of God. And so from the time God called Abram until Isaac was born, it was 25 years. Have you ever waited 25 years for a promise to come through? Typically, I don't wait that long. I like to help God along. And maybe you can relate to me. This was a long time to hold on to hope. And remember, the Hebrew writer says that Abram waited patiently. When Sarah was 90 years old and Abraham was 100, God did exactly what he said he would do. In verses 1 and 2 of chapter 21, he says, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. See, this is God's timing, not our timing. And so what does this tell us about God? It tells me, anyways, that his promises are not dependent on my perfection. This is huge for all of us. God's promises are not dependent on our perfection. It also tells me that when we mess up, he's still faithful. And it also tells me that he doesn't derail his plan when we try to take control. On the flip side, and this is where it hurts, on the flip side, it shows us the danger of going ahead of God. You see, Sarah's impatience didn't cancel God's promise, but it did bring unnecessary pain and division into their family. And we do the same. When we act outside of God's timing, it can bring unnecessary consequences that we never intended. And many of us are living with the consequences of choices we made outside of God's timing. So what does this mean for us today? It means that if you're waiting on God today, whether you're waiting for healing, whether you're waiting for provision, whether you're waiting for restoration or some type of direction in your life, that he has not forgotten you. It just may be taking longer than what you think. It may seem like nothing's happening, but God's promises are never delayed. He is working behind the scenes in ways that we could never expect. And do you know in the waiting period, it's the times where we learn the greatest lessons? And if you've already tried to take control, and you found yourself in a mess, take heart, because God is still faithful. Just as he worked through Abraham and Sarah's mistakes to fulfill his promises, he can work through our mistakes too. But the big question is what do we do while we're waiting? How do we remain faithful while we're waiting? Well, God invites us to trust. See, not in our ability to make things happen and rush him along, but in his perfect timing and in his faithfulness. I just want to transition here because God is faithful when we are not. But how can we trust him while we wait? When you're in this waiting season, there's always a temptation to kind of take matters into your own hands. It can be overwhelming. And Abraham and Sarah, they tried to help God along by bringing Hagar into the picture. But their impatience only led to more dysfunction and division within the family. But how often do we do the same? See, the good news is that God's mercy is greater than our mistakes. So I want to leave you with a few questions. What does it mean to surrender to God while we wait? Well, surrender doesn't mean we stop working. Surrender doesn't mean we do nothing. Surrender doesn't mean that we give up on life until God answers our promise, the promise he has for us. It means releasing control of the outcomes to God and trusting his plan even when we don't understand it. Here's a few practical ways that we can live out surrender. And I want to release the fact, if you're not a Jesus follower and you're just checking Jesus out and you're here, maybe someone invited you today, I just want you to know you're off the hook. This is for Jesus followers, people who've committed their lives to serving Jesus. Because Jesus is our king, and there's going to be some boundaries that Jesus has set for us that don't kind of coexist really well with the world. And there's going to be some things that seem kind of weird to most people. But if we trust him and live within those boundaries, we're going to find the blessing. But this is how we do that. And the writer of Proverbs says this in Proverbs 3, 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. He will make your paths straight. How many times have we taken our own path? I just want to say that we need to be a church family who lights up the path back to Jesus. He'll work through us. He'll work with us as we partner with him to help someone get back on the path, because sometimes we've strayed so far down a path that's taken us so far away from Jesus, we feel that we can never be accepted back. But we need to be people who get out of the way for helping people to get back to Jesus. But we need to trust in the Lord with all our heart, because trust is foundational. The other thing is, and this is what you expect, because I'm a minister and you're going to hear a church word, and it's prayer. The prayer is another way for us to surrender. And so the writer of Philippians, Paul, as he's writing this, says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. When we feel anxious or impatient, typically we're making up things in our head of what's going to happen before they ever do. And if we could just stop doing that, we won't feel so much anxiety. But if we could even put this into practice, we will feel even less anxiety by just giving it over to God. I just have to ask this. Have you ever experienced a time where you finally surrendered something over to God? You gave up trying to control it, and you just gave it up to God. And when you did, something happened. A door opened that you never expected. I'm sure a lot of us have a story like that or two, where we finally surrendered something over to God, and then all of a sudden a door opens that we would have never, ever expected. You know why? Because God doesn't waste waiting seasons. He doesn't waste waiting seasons. If we surrender and we trust and we stay faithful, he's going to bring about his purposes in his perfect timing. The other thing is, the world may tell you that surrender is like defeat. It's not. Surrender is not defeat. It's actually an invitation to deeper faith and peace. And so when we stop striving and we start resting in his promises, we actually open ourselves up to the incredible work that he's doing behind the scenes that sometimes we never see. So I have a challenge for you, and then we're going to move towards communion together. This is the challenge. I'd love for you this week to identify one area in your life that you're tempted to go ahead of God. One area where you're tempted to go ahead of God. Maybe you already have gone ahead of God. I'd love for you to surrender that to him and to pray and to trust. Only you can answer that question, but I just want to pause for a minute while you think about that so that you can take this week to really dig in. Remember, the promise to Abraham was that he was going to have many descendants. And that descendant was Jesus, ultimately. And he came, and this is who we're going to remember this morning. So as we just take a moment of silence, I want you to think about the promise and how long it took for Jesus to get here from the time he made a promise to Abraham. It's a long time. And maybe in your life you're waiting for a promise to come through, and it's taken a long time. But God is faithful. And so just take a moment to think of something that you need to surrender to him. Let's just be quiet for a moment.